Welcome, everyone. My name is Ahmed. I am Palestinian from Gaza, and I am delighted today to be in conversation with investigative journalist Asa Winstanley from the Electronic Intifada. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I am dialing in today and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. This land was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Like Palestine, this land is a ground zero of a genocide that occurred more than 200 years ago, and its echoes still reverberate to our day. I am dialing in from Camaragal country. By way of introducing us to this session, the events of October the 7th last year has taken the state of Israel by surprise. On October the 7th, 2023, hundreds of Palestinian resistance fighters led by Al-Qassam brigades, the military wing of the Palestinian Islamic Resistance Movement, Hamas, have breached the $220 million fortified fence around the Gaza Strip and entered areas of Israeli control, breaking the then 16-year-old siege. The operation triggered the most lethal military operation against Gaza, a genocidal campaign resulting in tens, if not hundreds, of thousands Palestinian killed and injured, and a complete annihilation of the basic infrastructure in Gaza. A small strip of land, 360 square kilometers, with a population of about 2.3 million, a small strip of land that was declared uninhabitable by the UN in 2020. More than a year now, with unspeakable, unimaginable atrocities committed in Gaza by the Israeli occupation forces, day in and day out, and much of the mainstream media coverage of the dire situation in Gaza and the analysis of the events that took place on October the 7th, 2023, have been marred with propaganda, false narratives, and diversions from the wider context of the Palestinian struggle for sovereignty and liberation. More than 1 year on, as a Palestinian in the West, I am exhausted by having to keep addressing what occurred on October the 7th and having to respond to questions as if the Palestinians only existed and started to exist after that day. The problem is, when such an anti-colonial resistance movement like Hamas is designated as a terrorist organization, unjustly, to my understanding, much of the accusations and twisted narratives around what actually occurred on that day becomes palatable and reasonable for public consumption in the Western society. But what actually occurred on that day and the actions of the Palestinian resistance and those who managed to break into what is called Gaza envelope cities was very quickly co-opted by the Israeli narrative and their proxy mainstream media organizations in order to manufacture consent around and justify the barbaric Israeli genocidal campaign that ensued in Gaza. Such organizations that have a long history of demonizing and smearing Palestinians in the West, and in doing so, obfuscating and attempting to erase evidence of what actually took place on October the 7th, 2023. And so it becomes imperative to keep addressing those events and responding to those accusations and allegations. Many journalists have conducted thorough research in the actual events of October the 7th and managed to produce evidence-based material to the complete contrary of the prevalent mainstream media narrative. These journalists include journalists from Electronic Intifada, like Ali Abu Nama, David Sheen, and Asa Winstanley, Max Blumenthal from The Grey Zone, just to mention a few. As I said, the Electronic Intifada has done a brilliant job tracking all these propaganda narratives and debunking them one by one ever since October last year in 2023. I had the privilege to interview Asa Winstanley from the Electronic Intifada a couple of days ago. Asa is an investigative journalist who lives in London. Asa has been writing about Palestine and Israel lobby since 2005. He spent 2 years living under Israeli occupation in the West Bank as an activist and a writer. He has been an associate editor and reporter with the award-winning website The Electronic Intifada for more than a decade now. And he is the co-host of their brilliant podcast, and I encourage everyone to go and follow their work. Asa is also the author of the best-selling book, Weaponizing Anti-Semitism, How the Israel Lobby Brought Down Jeremy Corbyn, published in 2023. Asa's recent article published on October the 7th, 2024, that's 1 year after the events of October the 7th, the anniversary of October the 7th, 2023. The article was titled, How Israel Killed Hundreds of Its Own People on 7 October. The article has made great revelations and debunked many of the Israeli and mainstream media false accusations made against Palestinian fighters, including the rape stories, the beheaded babies, the targeting of children, the Supernova festival, and more importantly, the implementation of Hannibal directive by the Israeli army on that day, intentionally killing tens, if not hundreds, of their own citizens. And so today, with the help of Asa Winstanley, we're going to go through all these accusations and allegations and try to debunk all the propaganda propagated by mainstream media and the Israeli side. I hope you'll find the conversation with Asa useful and productive.
Yeah.
Cool. So you published this astounding article, really, on the Electronic Intifada, and that was on the anniversary of 7 October 2023. And the article analyzed the events of 7 October in great details. And that article was actually the amalgamation of all the research throughout the whole year that you've done and colleagues of yours have done, like David Sheen and Ali Abu Nama and Electronic Intifada. The article was published on the anniversary, like I mentioned. So we want to go deeper into the research and the analysis of that article, just to point out some of the hidden information that is not really on the mainstream media. So being an investigative journalist working on Palestine for many years now and part of the Electronic Intifada. So could you first give us some insight on your research around the event of October 7th operation, or what Hamas calls Al-Aqsa flood operation. So let's start with the resources that you usually use or rely on in your reporting of the actual events that took place on October the 7th. What kind of resources that you usually use?
Good questions. Well, thank you for the kind words, Ahmed. Appreciate it. Like you said, it's a team effort, and we at the Electronic Intifada have been reporting on this issue for the last more than a year now, year and a month now, as we're filming this. And as you mentioned, it's there's a real reluctance, refusal, or in some cases fear to talk about these issues in mainstream media, in the sort of collective West, as it were, including Australia, if we include it in the sort of global North or the collective West. So that meant that it's been left to people like us at the Electronic Intifada and a few other independent outlets, like our friends at the Grey Zone, Mondo Wise, the Cradle, to talk about what really happened on the 7th of October. So I think we have done, despite our relatively modest resources, I think we've done collectively an incredible job, and we've successfully demolished Israeli narratives about what we've been calling, essentially what it was: misinformation, atrocity propaganda. So a great deal of claims that about what Palestinian fighters did on October 7th, that they beheaded people, that they raped people, and so on and so forth. And we've shown that this is all completely untrue, that there was no this idea that they beheaded children, that they beheaded babies, for example, was completely invented, and it was maliciously and deliberately invented in order to help promote what is happening in Gaza now, which is a genocide, which is the Holocaust of our times. And these horror stories that were invented by Israel about beheadings, rape, and so forth have really helped the support that's been given for Israel by Western governments and in Western media. So we saw it as urgent to kind of debunk that. We successfully debunked a lot of it, really the main, to the extent where the stories of the mass rapes have really been dropped now. So my colleague Ali Abu Nama was just talking about this on the Grey Zone live stream on the US election night this week, and he mentioned this fact that at the at come sort of roughly November, December 2003 time, a lot of the mainstream media was talking about the idea that Hamas had carried out a systematic campaign of rapes against Israelis in the kibbutzes and so forth. And there was, I'm sure you remember, there was even this, there was even a profile New York Times story about it. It's, screams before silence, and you know the former Facebook executive and billionaire Sheryl Sandberg did a whole film about it. And there was, it was very high profile, promoted by Hillary Clinton. There was all these claims by alleged eyewitnesses, that they'd seen rapes happening. No one actually came forward. There was nobody there was no alleged victim. There wasn't even an alleged victim that came forward, but there was people who claimed to have seen these people like Rami Davinian, Raz Cohen, and so forth. Now, but by now this has all collapsed to the extent that around about a month or so ago, a BBC film came out called "We Will Dance Again." It was directed by an Israeli soldier, a former Israeli soldier. And it was very slick. It was very, high production values and very emotionally, intended to emotionally engage the audience in sympathy with the Israeli settlers who had been the victims of the 7th of October offensive operation and so forth. Now, even though there was a couple of mentions, vague mentions, in general, the mass rapes thing had been dropped completely. All these alleged eyewitnesses, they disappeared because their stories had fallen apart, been completely demolished, shown to be fantasists and making things up. They weren't in that film at all. The closest they got to it, there was two people who said, well, they were afraid they would be, they would be raped, or that somebody would be raped. So all these things disappeared. All these things were really this narrative really was demolished, although it still crops up and is still sort of assumed to be true. The details of it have really been shown to be fantasy. So what I really wanted to do for this article, which, as you said, came out on 7th of October 2024, the first anniversary, I wanted to show, well, if if these things didn't happen, what really did happen. So I wanted to show, wanted to investigate the Israeli death toll, because for sure, around about 1,000 Israelis were killed, and a lot happened on that day. There was a lot of violence. There's no doubt about that. And so we can, I wanted to dive into what really happened. So to do that, the main sources really for this particular article are, as they have been for our reporting all along, which is why my colleague David Sheen has been so involved in it, as he's a fluent Hebrew speaker. Our main sources have been the Israeli press, and usually the Israeli media in Hebrew specifically, and quite often articles that haven't been translated into English, except by us. So, as well as that, there was a UN report that came out in June, which it wasn't very high profile. It was kind of buried. It was sort of mentioned in passing, and the conclusions of it, the aspect of it that was really buried was the Hannibal directive. And that really is the one of the main focuses of this article. In a nutshell, the Hannibal Directive is Israel's military doctrine. I've called it Israel's National Murder-Suicide Pact, whereby it's a kind of an open secret within Israeli society that the Israeli government has, the Israeli military has a doctrine, a directive, which allows it to target and kill its own soldiers if they're captured, in the eventuality that they're captured by Palestinian or Lebanese or other, Arab resistance fighters. If they're captured, the soldiers are captured, they can then be killed, bombed from the air, usually, or in whatever way, by the Israeli military in order to prevent them becoming captives, because the captives are important political leverage for the resistance groups. And as we know, in the past, Israeli soldiers have been exchanged for Palestinian prisoners. And this has happened now on October 7th. This military doctrine, which the Israeli, once it became exposed around about a decade ago, publicly, initially it was secret, there was, the Israeli military spokesperson kind of tried to imply that they'd revoked it without explicitly saying they'd revoked it. And they would say, "Oh well, this is a thing of the past, or it's been misinterpreted, or something like that." They were being really quite vague about it. But if you looked at the details of what they said, they never fully said, "Well, it's been revoked." But nonetheless, there was this impression that it had been revoked. But there's absolutely no doubt by now, when you look at all the sources, that it was reactivated on October 7th. Not only reactivated, it was expanded from soldiers to civilians, to Israeli civilians. And this explains the high, in part explains the high Israeli death toll. And I break down the death toll, and we look at examine how many of the 1,000 or 1,100 or so Israelis who were killed were actually civilians, and how many of those civilians were killed by Israel itself.
I mean, were these not, I mean, was that distinction made, or what the Hannibal directive implicitly mentioned in the UN report, saying, some of the Israelis were killed by crossfire or Israeli fire?
Yes, yeah, it was, yeah. And this is the aspect of that report that was really buried in the reporting. So this UN report by an investigative commission of the UN Human Rights Council was released in June, and the idea of the report was that it was to investigate the events of the 7th of October 2003, the actions of the Palestinian armed groups. It was to focus on that. And the whole raison d'etre of the report was that it was supposed to be a kind of balancing exercise, right? Because at the same time, the UN released a report on Gaza and on what the Israeli military had been doing in Gaza for the last 8 months, as it was then, since 7th of October 2023. So in order to, I'm sure they thought that in order to take the heat off us, because we're going to come under fire from the Israelis, proverbial fire, although of course the Israelis have literally fired on UN peacekeepers in Lebanon. But in order to kind of take the heat off us a bit, we'll do a balancing report on what Hamas did on October 7th. And so these two reports were released at the same time in June last year. And it was reported on by the media, but the Hannibal aspect wasn't. I didn't see really one mainstream media report about what this second report said about the Hannibal directive. There's a lot in it there about it. What they did report and what they did claim was that the way they presented it was, oh, Israel and Hamas both guilty of war crimes. So that was the kind
Yes.
of
Mm.
spin that they gave it. The Guardian reporting was very much like that, and there was nothing about the Hannibal directive. But yes, this report absolutely um, it does confirm, what we at the Electronic Intifada and some others had been saying for the previous year, that the Hannibal directive was carried out. It confirmed that 100% this definitely happened. Um,
Even in terms of the allegations of mass rape, and there was no clear evidence in the report. I mean, when it comes to reporters, I mean, I flipped through the report, and I read some parts of it. Most of the references there are actually coming from Israeli military or Israeli
right,
sources.
right, yeah, and
So
actually that's true. And generally speaking, this is a weakness of the report. Like the report, generally speaking, is a bit of a rush job. You can tell it's not very, there's basic errors in it. There's even just a few spelling mistakes and things like that. You can tell they kind of rushed it through so that it would be published, probably so that it would be published at the same time as the Gaza report that they put out. And yes, as you said, like, it overwhelmingly relies on Israeli sources. It takes them at face value, which fine, they're not lying every single time. We can agree that. Obviously, I use Israeli sources as well. But they should definitely be taken with a pinch of salt at the very least, especially considering Israeli military spokespeople have a very long history of just inventing things, especially when it comes to Palestinians and Lebanese, and other Arabs for that matter. But the reality is that the UN report takes the Israeli narrative generally at face value. So it does kind of go along with the atrocity propaganda to an extent. Although when you get into the details of it, it does debunk some of it as well. Although that's not really generally the focus of the report. It does allude to the fact that the Zaka organization, this Jewish extremist organization, which was empowered by the Israeli government and the Israeli military to be first responders, who were often the first to retrieve Israeli bodies, and in the aftermath of the 7th of October attack. And by now we know that they fabricated a lot of evidence. They tampered with evidence, and this UN report does say that. It does say that there was instances of that happening, although it doesn't specifically name Zaka as doing that. But we know that it was Zaka. We know that it was Yossi Landau. Yossi Landau, for example, infamously was one of several Israeli officials to claim that Israeli children were beheaded, and that Israelis were burned alive by Palestinian fighters. Completely invented. Completely invented. There were corpses. The Israeli military did, and Israeli Foreign Ministry did publish on their social media quite graphic images, and that includes some of them in this article, of corpses that had seemed to have been burnt alive in a car. But when you look at the footage, it's very clear this is not someone who's just been captured and set on fire, right? The car has very clearly been bombed from the air. Like, the car is completely annihilated. Like, the metal frame is twisted. It shows all the it shows all the signs of having been bombed from the air, by either
especially
an
that
Israeli.
Hamas fighters didn't have this kind of artillery on the grids to
Exactly,
use to kind of cause that kind of damage.
exactly. Palestinian resistance fighters do not have. They have very rudimentary drones that can, basically sort of kit drones that, on that sort of level, they can do things like, and we've seen footage of them doing things like drop a hand grenade. They get used for intelligence gathering, and so on and so forth, but not to launch a Hellfire missile like a Apache helicopter can do, and not to cause any level of the destruction that the Israelis do. And this particular footage of these two completely. I mean, to say burned is not really accurate. They were really incinerated, these two corpses. It's very clear that these particular two corpses, that the official Israeli Twitter account is still to this day, it hasn't been deleted, has claimed that these were Israelis burnt alive by Palestinians. Well, they probably were Israelis, but they were burnt alive by the Israeli military, almost certainly, because just the level of destruction makes it pretty much impossible. And there's evidence of this happening all over the south of occupied Palestine, or present day Israel, as they call it, all around the frontier settlements with the Gaza Strip. There's evidence of it happening time and time again, even in the built-up areas. So the reason they were doing this was, we know that this Hannibal directive was issued on this day, and we know from it later Israeli reporting, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz stated that the order that was given was not a single vehicle can return to Gaza. And we know from other Israeli reporting that there was multiple attack helicopters, drones, Elbit Hermes 450 drones, and F-16 and F-35 bombers within the first 24 minutes of the assault. And the UN report confirms this as well. It says that, quote, it confirmed at least 8 Apache helicopters were dispatched to the area around the Gaza border on the 7th of October, and that, quote, some 23 tanks were stationed around the whole border area with Gaza. Incidentally, that's a small sign of the mistakes in the report that I'm referring to, that make it a bit of a shoddy work. They talk about a border between Gaza and Israel. Well, of course, there's no border. Israel has never declared its borders, and this is a ceasefire line. You could call it a boundary, or frontier, or a ceasefire line, but it's not a border because Israel's never declared borders. So yeah, that's a bit of an aside. But the point here is that yeah, we know that the Israelis had these kind of weapons, very high-tech weapons. They were mobilized within minutes of the morning of 7th of October 2023. And we can see the evidence all around. In the built-up areas, in the kibbutzes, that the Palestinian fighters did attack with the intent to capture rather than kill. Of course, they did also attack well, we'll get into that perhaps about the military bases separately, but in these kibbutzes that were attacked by the Palestinian fighters in the course of that day, we see the evidence all around of houses being destroyed, houses being in some cases completely flattened. Now, the Palestinian fighters simply did not have the capabilities to do that. They had AK-47 assault rifles, they had hand grenades, they had RPGs, rocket propelled grenades. Okay, so yes, they can cause destruction, they can cause death, but they can't cause a mass flattening of an entire building in a way that Israeli aircraft and tanks can do. And this was very clear to me and my colleagues at the Electronic Intifada, just from the visual evidence early on. And the main reason for that is because, as you know, Ahmed, we've been covering Gaza, successive Israeli wars of annihilation targeting the Gaza Strip for many, many years. And the scenes of death and destruction are so familiar to us. Flattened houses, completely destroyed cars, incinerated corpses, all these graphic images that we see in Israel's successive wars, so-called cast-led 2008, 2009, 2014, 51 a day war, up again and again and again, these so-called mowing the lawn operations that Israel wanted to, it was really a long rolling genocide that Israel was carrying out in order to really, kill, access non-Jews as they really saw it. It was really a genocidal campaign all along. And because of these our familiarity with what these scenes look like for the first time on 7th of October, really, we saw not the same scenes, but in some ways similar scenes happening in the kibbutzes and in these frontier areas with the Gaza Strip against Israelis. Now, the fact is the Palestinians simply didn't have the military capabilities to carry these sort of this level of death and destruction out. It just doesn't exist. Yes, there was instances of Palestinians fighters killing Israeli soldiers, and in some cases, yes, non-combatants. That did happen. There's no doubt about that. But the primary goal that we know was to capture either soldiers or civilians alive and bring them back to Gaza in order to exchange for Palestinian prisoners. That was the primary goal of the operation. The primary goal was actually to assault and attack the military bases in the first instance. I know you do want to probably talk about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to come back to this idea that I've been hearing a lot recently. That October the 7th was a massive operation. It overwhelmed the Gaza military sites in what's called, Gaza envelope and so on and so forth. And it could have never been done by a bunch of, amateur paramilitary who were trained on a Kalashnikov without any sophistications. And the sentiment was, Israel actually had intelligence and they let them do it so that
Yeah,
they respond the way they're responding now. Well, what do you think about this sentiment?
yeah, I disagree with it. It is quite a common one, relatively common. We do see this, and actually, there's even some Israelis who say this on the fringes, who say, they're usually sort of anti-Netanyahu, but pro-Israel Israelis who say, they don't really have a problem with the genocide per se, but they don't like Netanyahu. They consider themselves maybe liberal Zionists or something like that, or just sort of anti-establishment from that point of view. And they say, well, the Israeli military is all powerful, the Israeli intelligence is all powerful, the Israeli military is so strong. How could they have let this happen? It must have been a conspiracy. They say things like, Netanyahu, moved a lot of the Israeli soldiers from the Gaza frontier to the West Bank in order to help settlers in the West Bank. That is true. That did happen. And they point out to things like you said, that there was intelligence that Palestinians, that Hamas were planning an operation along this scale. That is also true. However, by and large, I absolutely do not buy the fact that the Israelis planned this or that they allowed it to happen. And the reason for that is quite simple. If you look at it objectively, what happened on that day, it was a massive military defeat for Israel. That is just factually the case. The Gaza division, the entire Gaza division was wiped out. It was either killed or captured. The soldiers, all of the soldiers on the border were either killed, pretty much all the soldiers, all the Israeli soldiers on the Gaza frontier in the military bases that besieged the Gaza Strip were either killed or captured and taken as prisoners of war to the Gaza Strip, where many of them are still there to this day, although many have also been killed in Israeli bombing. And that was a military defeat. That was an unprecedented military defeat. Like, think about it. Like, we still haven't come to terms with this. And nobody has come to terms with this. This is the first time ever that Palestinians in the history of the Israeli colonization of Palestine have ever recaptured territory and held it, even if it was just for a few hours. That's never happened. That's never happened in Palestine. You could point in the 1960s to the PLO and the Jordan supported by the Jordanian army to a limited extent. The Battle of Karama in Jordan, where for the first time Palestinian fighters held their ground before retreating, and they fought the Israeli army standing. That was a military success in that level, but they didn't recapture any territory in Palestine. That's what happened. That's what happened on October 7th. That will that no matter what has happened since then, that military and intelligence defeat by the Palestinian fighters against the Israelis can never be taken away. They can never. I conclude the article with a quote from an Israeli source, which really highlights this, which highlights, it's not me saying this. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is the objective military analysis of what happened. This is so I mentioned one of these Hebrew sources, and one of the main ones that I've used in the last year, and I use extensively again in this report, is an article that was published in January in the weekend supplement of the Israeli newspaper Yediot Ahronot. The supplement is called 7 Days. The article was very long. It was published only in Hebrew. Yediot Ahronot quite often translates his articles into English. This one was not translated into English. In my view, even though it's a highly, highly significant article, in my view, it was never translated into English on purpose because it just shows the Israeli. Number one, it talks extensively about the Hannibal directive and confirms the fact that it was reactivated on 7th of October and that civilians were targeted using it. And number two, it just shows the Israeli military in such a bad light. Although, from the point of view of the journalists who are writing it, they're just trying to help the Israeli military improve, quote unquote, from their perspective. So, what all the sources of this article are the top levels of the Israeli military and intelligence establishment, and we know that. Even though the sources are quite often anonymous, we know that because of the journalists. The journalists who wrote it are very, very close to the Israeli political and military establishment. The names of Ronan Bergman and Yoav Zeytun. Now, Ronan Bergman in particular is also a New York Times journalist who wrote very, very high profile. He's written best-selling books, which are essentially hagiographies of the Israeli intelligence establishment of the Mossad and so forth. And he's quite often the source of Israeli disinformation, in my view, but Israeli military intelligence disinformation. But nonetheless, he provides some very serious sources, and what he says in this article, he quotes it. He gets in this. His sources were actually in the headquarters of the Israeli high command on the 7th of October, and they were watching events unfold. And their intelligence was so defeated on the day that they, according to this article, they were relying on Hamas or pro-Hamas Telegram channels to see what was happening because the fighters had destroyed 40% of the communications infrastructure within minutes. We saw the footage of the sort of kit drones dropping hand grenades on towers, on watchtowers, on automatic gun towers and so forth, and on tanks. And so because of this, they wiped out the 40% of the communications infrastructure. And that's why, just quite often the Israelis in the kibbutzes they couldn't get through on cell phones and things like that. And even, the military had to rely on using WhatsApp groups, local WhatsApp groups, which normally they would never be allowed to do in a military context. And so, the headquarters is called Hakira, the Kira headquarters of the Israeli military in Tel Aviv. It's actually in a civilian area in Tel Aviv. I've seen it myself when I was living in occupied Palestine. I went into the 48 territories at one point, and I did see it. And anyone who travels around 1948 Palestine, so-called present day Israel, you see how embedded the Israeli military is within the civilian population, and this headquarters, according to Bergman and Zeytun, underneath this headquarters, the underneath this complex, the top headquarters, they have a bunker which is called the pit, deep underneath this complex. And in this pit, the so-called pit, they were watching this unfold on the day, and they were trying to come to terms with what happened and trying to understand what happened, because at first they didn't understand what would happen. They thought maybe it was just a small incursion of a few fighters here and there. And the significance of it, what they said was, number one, um, well, on the significance of it at first, they said, quote, it is unimaginable. It is like the old city of Jerusalem in the War of Independence, or the outposts along the Suez Canal during the Yom Kippur War, the October War of 1973. We thought that this could never happen again. This will remain a scar burnt into our flesh forever. So this was an unprecedented military defeat. There's, you know, there's no way that this was done purposefully by Israel, by any aspect of it. It's just, what have they gained from it? They've done a, yes, they've done a genocide, but militarily they haven't gained anything. Netanyahu, the moment the war stops, Netanyahu will probably be out, politically speaking. The moment there's a ceasefire, which is why he's so desperate to stop a ceasefire. The Another thing that they said that was quoted by Bergman and Zaytoun in this article from this headquarters was, quote, the Gaza division was overpowered. And the source who was present, who recorded this to the journalist, said, these words still give me the chills. We still haven't come to terms with just what a massive military and intelligence defeat it was for Israel. And that is so important, because Israel sells itself as this military and intelligence asset to the West, to America, to the United States, and to Australia, and to this sort of collective West. But if they couldn't predict and they couldn't stop this from happening, if their vaunted, Mossad intelligence operation couldn't predict that this was going to happen accurately and stop it, prevent it from happening, then of what use is it? If all its high-tech weaponry couldn't stop Palestinian fighters from doing what they did and take in, around about 250 captives. And there's no doubt initially they took more, but many of these captives were killed on the way to Gaza. So 250 were ended up taken. It seems if Israel couldn't stop that happening, then it's not this great all-powerful intelligence and military operation that it claims to be.
100%. I mean, they would have found their captives by now anyway, if they actually knew that this is going to happen. I mean, the sentiment is, I think Hamas's operation as an organization, I think it's similar to, in their organizing at least, I think it's similar to Hezbollah. I mean, garnering all the skills and experience and talent in the population. I mean, talking about I don't mean to brag, but we know that the Palestinian population is one of the highest rate of literacy, for example. So there's
Yeah,
engineers, there's all that technical experience. I mean, look at for example, the videos that they produce in that combat with the Israelis that John Elmer usually alludes to. It's unbelievable the way they built the tunnels, the way they designed the whole operation, taking recording every single operation that they do. It's just that level of sophistication. I think it's very condescending to say that Israel let them do it. I mean, when I was
yeah,
in Gaza, we took a tour around the siege where it goes into the buffer zone, and you could see the surveillance post of the Hamas government is on this spot, and then across the siege there's the Israeli one. So they're
yeah.
seeing each other eye to eye, and they know they're monitoring each other, and they knew about each other's presence.
100%, 100%. And yeah, you're right. It is this kind of theory is quite condescending to Palestinians to say that they wouldn't have been capable of doing it. there's no doubt that the Hamas and other Palestinian fighters, the level of high tech equipment is not, and just the level of pure death and destruction is not on the same level as the Israeli military, which has the backing of all these powerful Western states. But the level of human ingenuity is, if anything, definitely superior to the Israelis because, you're talking about a people who are besieged and who are standing on their own land. And so they're going to go all out to try and reclaim that and to try and get it back and to try and defend themselves. And, if nothing else, then to go down fighting. So, this is the weakness of the Israelis. They underestimated their enemy. So like they said, like I said, they had they had this intelligence. They claim now after the fact to have had the Hamas plan for October 7th, or at least a plan that was very similar to what turned out to be October 7th. They claim to have had it in advance. Now, these claims have definitely got to be taken with a pinch of salt at the very least. This could be made up. They could just be sort of saying they could be trying to play down their their intelligence defeat because the 7th of October was a massive intelligence defeat by the Palestinian intelligence because let's be realistic. These resistance organizations also have an intelligence branch. So they're running counterintelligence, and so so they claim to have had it. The New York Times has done stories about it. I believe that might have been Ronan Bergman actually who's done the story about this in the New York Times. I can't recall, but certainly the New York Times. And they claim that this plan, this Hamas plan they received in advance, they call it Operation Jericho Well, I think, or something like that. That's what they claim their source to be. Now, let's just say that, like I said, we've got to take that definitely with a big pinch of salt. But even if you say, for the sake of argument, okay, they had the plan, well, then that doesn't reflect well on them either because they didn't stop it from happening. It doesn't reflect well on them from the sort of the point of view of their Western allies. They didn't stop it. They had the plan. That's almost worse in a way. They had the plan and they didn't act on it. So whichever way it is, whether it's true or not, it was a massive intelligence defeat for them. And we can see the preparations that, in retrospect, it's quite clear to see the preparations that Hamas made for October 7th. Really, it's said to have been 2 years in the planning, and you can see in those previous 2 years there was, and we covered it at the Electronic Intifada. There was instances of the Hamas government executing Palestinian collaborators in the Gaza Strip, um, quite often at the urging, quite often at popular urging, it has to be said. Um, you know, Palestinians, as in the case of every liberation struggle, the native population, it happens, unfortunately, that there are small elements of the native population that ends up siding with the colonizer. Whether usually it's not ideological. It's more the motives are more cynical. They're either financial or quite often blackmailed as well. Unfortunately, in one way or another. But the reality is, there was a series of executions that took place in the previous few years before in the Gaza Strip before October 7th, and it's quite easy to see now that that kind of uprooting of the Israeli collaborator network within the Gaza Strip must have played a huge part in the intelligence defeat um,
And
of
Sinwar himself was heading that group. It's called the Majd, I think, as I recall.
right. Interesting. Well, yeah, I didn't know the name of it, but yes, absolutely. Yahya Sinwar, the late leader of Hamas, was at the time the leader the leader in Gaza, the Hamas leader in Gaza, and he led this operation. Yeah, you're right. It was his Yahya Sinwar's whole role was really often in counterintelligence for Hamas. So that is the whole uh yeah, there's a lot of kind of circles in history here, right? Because the reason that they operated the Hannibal directive was to stop the exchange of prisoners, was to stop, essentially to stop prisoners being released. And it's more than that, it's deeper than that. They didn't want to make a concession, they didn't want to acknowledge defeat in this way. Because it's not so much about the prisoners being released necessarily as the fact that it was a defeat for them, something that's been imposed on them, and they want to be in control. They want to remain the colonial power. And if their control is eroded, then that colonial power is eroded. And so in the last successful prisoner exchange of the Israeli soldier
Gilad Shalit.
Gilad Shalit, thank you,
Mm.
which was when was he released? It was 2011, right? Is that right?
2011, yes.
Yeah,
Mm.
it's in my article. I believe it was 2011, and he was released. One soldier who had been previously captured by Palestinian fighters in the Gaza Strip, where he was a prisoner of war. But when he was released, he was exchanged for 1,024 Palestinian prisoners. An amazing figure. And if you take that precedent and you compare it to the 250 or so Israelis who were captured on 7th of October, even though they weren't all soldiers, and you added it to the number of Palestinian hostages held in Israeli captivity, which who are hardly ever talked about, by the way, in the mainstream media. It was several thousand. It was at the time, I believe it was around about 5 or 6 thousand. Many of them held without charge or trial in so-called administrative detention. If you compare that figure, so if you timed the 1,024 by 250, then it was easily enough to empty the entire prisons
Mm.
of the Israelis, including very, very high profile resistance leaders like uh, like Marwan Barghouti, of course, and Ahmed Sadat of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And in that Gilad Shalit prisoner exchange, one of the people released was, of course, Yahya Sinwar.
Mhm.
So, who would then go on after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, would then go on to be chosen, elected by the Hamas collective leadership as the leader of Hamas until he was killed in combat last month with the Israeli military. So it's there's a lot of circles in history.
Absolutely. I mean, even the hostages now that they're still with, I mean, hostages, I keep calling them hostages. I mean, we also have hostages in there, prisoners, whatever.
Captives,
They,
captives, and captives and prisoners of war. The
captives,
soldiers are prisoners
exactly.
of war.
Prisoners of war, exactly. I mean, those prisoners of war, actually, they're trying to actively, um, completely destroy them or kill them because they just want to get rid of this problem. I think I was saying the other day, I think Israel thinks that it's actually fighting a war of liberation of some sort, because this is just it is trying to achieve the original Zionist project, which is completely evacuating the entirety of Palestine from Palestinians, and then it found a good reason to do it. It found an alibi, a pretext
Yeah, they're
with
trying to
others.
complete they're trying to complete what they carried out in 1948, and then now they're saying it openly. Since 7th of October, they've been saying openly. Israeli ministers have been saying that they want to carry out. Well, they said at the time, we're rolling out Nakba 2023. They're saying it openly. They're using the Arabic word Nakba for catastrophe because they know the significance that it has for Palestinians, which is being expelled, wiped out, annihilated, driven out of their homeland, and that's what they want to try and complete. But they're seeing it that way, but they're still failing to do it. Never mind the fact that they haven't been able to after a year. You mentioned the sophistication of the Palestinian resistance's let's call it information operation, where they're releasing all these videos. After a year of fighting, after more than a year of fighting, Palestinian fighters are still fighting and engaging with Israeli soldiers all over the Gaza Strip. They're still killing Israeli soldiers. They're still blowing up Israeli tanks. And not only that, but they managed to film themselves doing it regularly, frequently, weekly. We're seeing these new videos of these operations time and time again. Israeli soldiers are still making basic, you mentioned my colleague John Elmer, who analyzes these every week on the Electronic Intifada live stream that we put out. Um, you know, time still, we're 13 months in now, and they're still. We have this ongoing theme in some of these videos of Israeli soldiers standing in windows. They're making these basic military errors. And they can be sniped and they're attacked with RPGs and so on and so forth. And it's astonishing that this is still happening, that the fighters are still fighting. Not only that, as you mentioned, they're still filming these videos. They're filming themselves doing it, which is, from the perspective of the Palestinian fighters, is important for their what they call the popular cradle. In other words, the popular support, the mass support of their population for the resistance to keep on fighting against the Israelis.
Mm.
And they're still doing that. They're still doing that. 13 months on is still happening.
And it's not just, fixing a camera at your head and going and doing it and then just send the actual video. No, they go back and they montage it. They produce an actual film with different
Yeah.
angles, with different cameras, and they just assemble the whole thing and then they send it. So it's just
Yeah.
mind-boggling how they do this whole process, where and how. And, it's just so many questions.
Yeah, I don't understand it. I mean, you can see some of the things that some of their systems in the videos, like for example, they don't use mobile phones. They have they use landlines. They have closed lines that they use to communicate with each other. And you can see the cameras are so you can see here that this is human ingenuity over high tech. It's sort of low tech. So quite often the cameras they use are you can tell they're repurposed reverse cameras from cars. You have on some cars or SUVs, you have a little camera on the back of the car to help you reversing, and it has like the lines on it
Mm.
to help you sort of do parallel parking. Well, these cameras that the fighters are using to set up ambushes and so forth are those reverse cameras, because you can tell because the lines are actually on lens. So, it's human ingenuity. It's low tech, sort of low footprint, repurposed technology. This is it's a guerrilla warfare. It's Vietnam 2024.
I mean, this is basically Palestinians in Gaza. They're used to being kind of creative with these things. I remember that at some point we were using the cooking oil for cars because we didn't have any
Mm.
petrol or gas. It's amazing how people survive under these kind of conditions.
Yeah, it's testament to human ingenuity.
Yes, yeah, yeah. And all these videos that you're talking about, I mean, John Elmer does a brilliant job in documenting everything and explaining how they're actually being implemented on Electronic Intifada. But something I've been grappling with, I think you mentioned in your article about the Supernova Festival. I
Mm.
mean, with all the surveillance, with all the knowledge that Hamas had around the area, I mean, couldn't they anticipate that there's something like the Supernova Festival happening and at least avoid being around these areas? I mean, we hear in the mainstream media that a lot of civilians or the youth who are attending that festival have been murdered allegedly by Hamas resistance fighters. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on these?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, you know, despite the fact that there's no doubt that the Hamas preparations were quite elaborate and sophisticated for the assault on 7th of October, it wasn't they weren't omnipotent. They've acknowledged making mistakes. The Palestinian the political leadership of Hamas put out a document last year. The title was Our Narrative, where they explained the rationale and motivation for the October 7th attack and the reasons and the goals of the assault, the military goals of the assault. And they say in that some mistakes happened in implementation on the day. And one of these that we can see in retrospect, and I analyze this in the article as you allude to, one of the mistakes in retrospect was that it does seem that there was a failure by the Hamas intelligence or the whoever planned the assault to anticipate the presence of this supernova rave. And the reasons for that I concluded are fairly simple. It's essentially the rave was secret. It wasn't fully secret, but its location wasn't announced in advance. If you look at the website, you can still see their website in Hebrew and English is still up online. I linked to it in my piece. It says that the location of the supernova rave will be announced on the day on the evening of October the 6th. And that's what happened. And the reasons for that, I don't fully understand the reasons why it was secret, but I just think I think it's part of the culture of these kind of trance raves. So in the West, I mean, I'm sure it's probably similar in Australia, but in the especially in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, there was a whole trend of trance and raves, and they would quite often be illegal. They would be put on, below the radar of the authorities. They wouldn't be licensed, and they'd quite often be out in the countryside, and and they would usually involve psychedelic drugs, and there was a lot of drugs in the supernova rave as well, by all accounts. And so, yeah, I mean, it's part of the whole milieu of this kind of rave scene to have these secret locations. Now, the supernova rave wasn't illegal and under Israeli law. It was coordinated with the Israeli police and local authorities, and there were armed Israeli police present and security guards present on the day itself. As I mentioned, Israel is a very highly militarized society, so many of the rave goers themselves were off-duty combat soldiers, and some of them did take up weapons as the assault was unfolding. Now, so for whatever reason, they had this arrangement whereby the location of the rave would be announced at the last minute. So, that's the reason why the Hamas didn't know about it taking place. And that's the reason why there was an element of chaos to what unfolded on the day, especially when what happened with the rave happened. So it's quite interesting if you look at this film that I mentioned earlier, We Will Dance Again. You can kind of see some of it unfolding in that. Israeli authorities later, the Shin Bet, the Israeli secret police intelligence sort of torture agency, really, but Israel's so-called domestic intelligence agency, they later concluded that Hamas had no prior knowledge of the rave, so it wasn't a target. If you look at a map, which I did for the purposes of this piece, for the research for this piece, you look at a map and you see you find the location of the rave, the supernova rave. You can see it's between the Gaza Strip and the Ra'im military base. So it's the closest site to where the supernova rave, the fields where the supernova rave was happening. The closest site to it is the Ra'im kibbutz and the neighboring Ra'im military base. The Ra'im military base is or was the regional headquarters. It's the headquarters of the Israeli military. It's the headquarters of the Gaza division. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that was the main target, the number one target of the Palestinian assault on that day. That's what they were all aiming for. Now it does seem to have been the case that when the Palestinian fighters were headed for this base. You know, they unexpectedly stumbled upon this party that was taking place. And you know, it's unclear how many of the people who died around of the rave goers who were fleeing this rave. It's unclear how many of them were killed by Palestinians and how many were killed by Israeli by Israel itself in either Hannibal operations or crossfire, because there were gun battles that took place between the Israeli police and Israeli security guards who were present at the rave and the Palestinian fighters. It's so because it took part in open fields, the evidence for the Hannibal killings is quite often not as clear as when it took place in Kibbutz Be'eri, for example, the most famous instance of a Israeli Hannibal massacre, because we know very clearly about, because there was two surviving Israeli civilians who said yes, it was the Israelis who shot at us with tanks and gunfire and so forth. So that's very clear. It's a bit more murky in the case of the Supernova rave, but there's no doubt that there was a lot of chaos that was happening, and as I said, the Hamas political leadership has said that mistakes were made.
Absolutely. Look, there's so much to talk about on Hannibal Directive, but I mean, I will refer whoever is listening to your article. Your article is named How Israel Killed Hundreds of Its Own People on October the 7th, and it's released on Electronic Intifada on October the 7th, 2024, 1 year after the Operation October 7th that triggered the genocide that is currently ongoing. I mean, it's really, thank you so much for that insight. It's really important to highlight and combat the Zionist propaganda in the West of the Palestinians, because this propaganda has been used not only to demonize Hamas, but to kind of gag any narrative about the Palestinian struggle in general. And speaking of Zionists, I mean, you had your share experience in witnessing what the Zionists lobbies in the UK are doing to pro-Palestine community and political figures. I mean, you wrote a book about how the Zionist lobby has targeted Jeremy Corbyn. So
Yeah.
could you just tell us a little bit about the book that you've written about this incident, and what motivated you to write a book about that particular incident?
Yeah, I've been. I think I've got it on. Yeah, it's behind my head, unfortunately, but yeah, you can see it there on the shelf behind me. Weaponizing Anti-Semitism: How the Israel Lobby Brought Down Jeremy Corbyn. Available from allbooks.com and all good retailers. Yeah, I reported on from the moment that Jeremy Corbyn became even a candidate to lead the Labour Party in the summer of 2015. I began reporting on the whole issue because Corbyn had been somebody who was known in the Palestine Solidarity movement in Britain for many years. He was a patron of the Palestine Solidarity campaign, for example. You know, I'd shared platforms with him. We'd spoken at some of the same events, and you know, he always struck me as a genuine guy because he wasn't there trying to claim glory. You know, he was doing things like he would chair a meeting, you know, and things like that. So, you know, I knew straight away that he was going to be attacked by the pro-Israel lobby and that he was going to be smeared as an anti-Semite and all these kind of lies that they always do to anyone in the solidarity movement. And so I reported on that. I ended up reporting on it for, well, I mean, the story's still going on now, really, in a way, but there was many years there of reporting on it, and there was so much reporting I'd done on it when he became the leader of the Labour Party, and the smears really went into overdrive because they went all out to try and stop him becoming prime minister, and it has to be said they succeeded in that. There was so much reporting; it just felt like it needed a book to kind of bring it all together, and that's what I did. And yeah, we put this book out last year, and it's been pretty successful, And one of the interesting things was I was really my publisher. It's a they've done a great job. All books based in New York, and they've supported the book, but they don't. They're an independent publisher. They don't have the resources of a giant mainstream publisher, and so they put on some events for me, so that was good. But I did a tour. Really, I ended up doing a tour of Britain, of Scotland, Wales, and England, um, and I all over. Like I must have done more than a dozen venues, and it was all grassroots. Like people, what because there was like grassroots local groups, former Labour Party members, Palestine solidarity groups. They all wanted to talk about the issue because it'd been kind of a traumatic experience for the Palestine what you could call the Palestine solidarity left of the Labour Party, which ended up being expelled really or pushed out of the Labour Party with the after Corbyn. There was such a desire for people to talk about the issue and debate the issues, and my book was a way for people to do that, and so they really wanted to have the discussion, and quite often the audience for the book actually knew a lot of what was in it already because they'd lived through it, but they felt validated by reading it, but also angry, that this had happened, and we came very close to having a prime minister in Britain who
Pro-Palestinian.
yeah, who was sympathetic to the Palestinians, and who would have had moderately social democratic policies, which would have been popularly supported. And so the pro-Israel lobby in this country, in collusion with the actual state of Israel itself, really launched a quite successful operation in order to sabotage that and to stop him becoming prime minister. And yeah, the book is the chronicle of that disaster.
And I remember a few years back before your book was published, Al Jazeera has published a number of episodes
Mm.
documenting, they called The Lobby, and
Hmm.
documenting their own, the Zionist agents, or I think their own agents infiltrating the Zionist groups and
Yeah.
getting some inside information. And it was all, on camera. It was brilliant documentary. I think it's 4 parts.
That's right. There was actually two series that Al Jazeera did. They did one for the British pro-Israel lobby and then a second one for the American pro-Israel lobby. And these were, as you said, these were undercover journalists who managed to infiltrate pro-Israel lobby groups in the UK for the first series and in the US for the second series. Interestingly, Al Jazeera unfortunately never officially released the US series. It was scuppered, ironically, after a lobbying campaign by the pro-Israel lobby in the US. And Al Jazeera never aired it, but Electronic Intifada, we managed to obtain a copy, and we released it ourselves online on our YouTube channel, still up there now. You can watch it, and yeah, those two series, I believe they're both 4 episodes each. Those two series are both really important, and they're both some of my important sources for the book. I cite, especially the UK one, I cite many times in the book.
So, I mean, you've been doing all that work to combat the Zionist narrative. You've written this book, and you were, investigative journalist, revealing all the lies and propaganda that Zionists try to propagate in the Western society in general. Do you think that has anything to do with, I mean, if you're comfortable to talk about what happened recently to you? I mean, your house was raided, and some of your equipment were confiscated. Do you think that has anything to do with your work against the Zionist lobby or
Yeah.
pro? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it must do. It must have a lot to do with it. Yeah, so last month on the 17th of October, at there was a pre-dawn raid on my house by so-called counter-terror police. And yeah, they confiscated all my main devices that I use for my journalism, my computer, my laptop, my phone, several other devices. Um, and yeah, it was shocking, but not entirely surprising because they'd done it to several other people, including in the last year, including the author and contributor to the Electronic Intifada, Tony Greenstein, a renowned Jewish anti-Zionist author who wrote a really good book about Zionism during the Holocaust um, in the 1930s and 40s.
Oh, I didn't know that they raided his house as well. I mean, I'm about to have a
Yeah,
conversation with him next week.
yeah, that
That's
was last year in December last year, and so nearly a year ago now. Yeah, they raided his house. They took all his devices, and they actually arrested him. What was unusual in my case is they didn't arrest me. They just
mm,
took the devices. In Tony's case, they arrested him, and they even imposed bail conditions on him, to say that he couldn't post on Twitter anymore. I believe there was other provisions as well. So, but his lawyer was able to go to court and get the bail conditions overturned because they were basically illegal. They were really definitely unjust. So they were overturned. Maybe that was why they didn't bother arresting me because they knew that any bail conditions would soon be overturned. I don't know. That's speculation on my part, but it is unusual that they didn't arrest me. They just confiscated the stuff. It just seems like intimidation of journalists. Obviously, as a journalist, yeah, it happened to another journalist as well, Richard Medhurst, who, of course, streams regularly
mm.
online. Um, yeah, well, he was actually coming into the UK, so they confiscated all his devices while he was crossing the border. Yeah, so they wouldn't tell me what this was all for. They just said that it was under counter-terrorism law and that it related to social media posts that I had made, or
Mm.
that they claim I had made, and they wouldn't tell me which social media posts, but they did say the investigation had been going on for a year. So it
Mm.
implies
Without
that
you
it was,
knowing.
yeah, exactly. Without me knowing, there was no forewarning of this. They didn't say, you can't tweet that. They didn't say we're going to come to your home. There was nothing. They didn't summon me for an interview, nothing like that. It was without warning. We were swooped on while it was still dark. It was 5:40 a.m. So, it was quite shocking in that way, but not entirely surprising, as I said. And yeah, it's been it's it just seems like an intimidation and a harassment of journalists who are trying to do the work that I've been doing, as you said.
Mm.
And we hope that in weeks and months and perhaps even years to come, we will discover the full reasons for it. My legal team is working on it. And if I don't know yet whether or not they'll bring any charges against me or for anything that I've said or written in the past. I don't know. And that seems to be part of the effect that they want to try and chill the free speech on this, although they claim that's not their intention. But I I do think that we will definitely find out more in the future about why this happened. And it does seem to me that it is an attempt to stop this kind of journalism because it's kind of price that they're trying to impose on us for the journalism we've done, exposing the lies of the pro-Israel lobby. The pro-Israel lobby is very embedded now in this government, in this Labour government that we have.
Mm.
Ironically, a lot of the people that I write about in the book are now in government in one form or another. And so it does make me wonder, is there a degree of vindictiveness and revenge and to try and stop me from doing the reporting that I'm doing? I can say it's not going to stop me from doing that. They would they'd have to lock me up to stop me from doing that. Even then, I would write for myself if I could. So yeah, so they won't stop me so easily. I can definitely say that.
Yeah, hopefully it's not going to get to the point where they lock you up, but
Yeah,
yeah.
hopefully not. I mean, I think this could hopefully this is the end of it. That it is just kind of harassment campaign, but we don't know. Like they kind of keep these things hanging over people. Whether or not it's the end for me. You know, it's not the end for other people. It's happening again and again to other people, and just this. We were just talking about this before we started recording. Before just this last weekend in Britain, Chaim Brashith, who is a Jewish retired academic, former Israeli actually, and he was speaking at a Palestine solidarity protest, and he was arrested by police, again using these so-called counter-terror powers for his speech. And you can watch the speech on the website Squawk Box, which does some really great journalism on this whole issue. Has done of the Labour Party, um, and in that speech, I mean, we don't know exactly. You never know because they never really say exactly, or it takes some time at least. They don't say exactly what in the speech was the problem, but it seems what they objected to was the fact that he said in this speech that Israel has been unable to defeat Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. Now that's just a matter of fact. That's all kinds of journalists are saying that. Pro-Israel journalists are saying that in some cases. Some Israelis are saying that. I just quoted from top Israeli in my article from top Israeli military echelons, probably from generals. They're anonymous quotes, but definitely the high levels of the Israeli military saying that 7th of October was a military defeat. Now, those are a matter of fact. It's not a matter of so much of interpretation or opinion. And so we're reaching a stage now where British authorities, spurred on, it has to be said, by the pro-Israel lobby, by Zionist groups and so forth, are even trying to punish people, reporters, academics, campaigners who are simply stating objective facts. Like it's not even an analysis or an opinion, it's an objective reality. So it's very, very dangerous territory, and I think it's a liability for them long term because they're not really thinking, I don't think, of these things coming to court because they're not going to you know, these things are not going to be able to stand before a jury, for example. So it does seem to be more about short-term intimidation and stopping the solidarity movement because or intimidating the solidarity movement because you know it's been going on for the last year, for the last 13 months. People carry on demonstrating, they carry on campaigning. Uh, in the UK, as I'm sure you know, we have a group called Palestine Action, which has been carrying out direct action and effectively sabotage of Israeli arms firms, the Israeli arms company
Albert.
Albert,
Yeah,
yeah, which
yeah,
makes
Albert.
drones. And incidentally, one of the main drones they make was the Hermes 450, which is the same drone that I mentioned earlier, was used to kill Israelis on 7th of October.
Mm.
So, and we know that for a fact. So, yeah, this is what's going on, what's being carried out. Um, but they're doing their best to try and stop all these things. But it's a kind of a sign of the silver lining, despite all the repression, is that it's a sign of desperation from them. It's a sign that they can't stop this movement.
100%. That's what Professor Sari Makdisi says. I mean, all these gagging, all that pressure against the pro-Palestine community is just a sign of weakness. It's a sign of faltering of the Zionist narrative because they don't have a narrative to counter argue what the Palestinians are demanding. It's just they're empty, and therefore they use just force intimidation to stop us from telling our stories at least. On that note, Asa, I don't want to take longer of your time, more of your time. I really want to thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a great conversation. Hopefully, we can invite you again, or yeah, at
Sure.
some point, maybe in person in Australia. You never know if you ever come to Australia.
Yeah, that would be lovely. Well, thank you for having me, Ahmed. Appreciate it. And yeah, it was a good conversation.